Kia ora koutou, and welcome everyone to our webinar for Adapting to Sea Level Rise in Purau and Koukourarata. My name is Crystal Anderson. I'm an engagement advisor here at Council and your host for this webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join us online tonight. We'll start by covering some background on the work that's been done to date, and then we'll move through some of the detail on the draft adaptation pathways for Purau, and then we'll move on to Koukourarata. We'll pause for questions at the end of each session, so just feel free to pop those in the chat when you've got them. First, I'll introduce you to the team behind the screen and let you know how you can participate during the session. I'll then hand over to our presenters who will run you through the presentation. So tonight, you'll be hearing from Tom, who is our Principal Advisor of Coastal Adaptation, also from Ruby, who is a Senior Adaptation Advisor, and we also have Jane, the team leader of Coastal Adaptation. Your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving, but you can ask questions in the Microsoft Teams chat, which is located in the top bar menu as a speech bubble. If you're not able to use this feature, you can email questions through to us at letstalk@ccc.govt.nz. If you're hard of hearing or you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just click on the three small dots above the More at the top of your Teams screen and click Turn on Live Captions down the bottom of the drop-down list. One last thing from me, hopefully the banner came up to let you know that this session is being recorded. This recording will be shared on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and you'll receive a link via email showing you how to access this recording, along with the Q&A doc with the questions for this session. So I'll now hand over to Ruby, who will start the presentation.
Kia ora koutou. Firstly, just to echo what Crystal said, a big thank you from us and the rest of the team for taking time out of your nights to be with us here. Hopefully you find it informative, and we really hope that you use it as an opportunity to ask any questions that you've got or want to have answered before you submit your feedback online. So I'm going to kick us off with a bit of an overview of our program and some of the upfront context before I'll pass over to the rest of the team. So we know that as the climate is warming, sea levels are going to rise, and that means that coastal hazards like coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and rising groundwater are more likely to impact our low-lying inland and coastal communities. And that's an issue. We've got things or people or places that we care about that could be impacted. Council is going through a process of identifying these risks, and we'll be working with communities right across the district to plan for how we can proactively adapt to and manage these risks over the next 100 years. So quite a long time frame. Get Crystal to flick to the next slide. So the Ministry for the Environment has provided councils with guidance on how to undertake this type of adaptation planning. We took that guidance and set out how we were going to adapt it to the unique context here in Christchurch and the coastal adaptation framework. So that's the picture on the left-hand side of your screen. Among other things, that sets out 7 key guiding principles, including the decision to focus public funds on public assets. I'm not going to go into it in any more detail today, but if you are interested in reading the document, Crystal's just posted a link in the chat, and you can also find that on our website as well. The key takeaway really is that adaptation planning is designed to be a really cooperative or co-design process between councils and communities. So to make this achievable, we split the district up into different areas and made the decision to pilot our process here in what we call the Whakaropo Lyttelton Harbour to Koukourarata Port Levy Adaptation Area. We also pulled together a coastal panel, and so that is a diverse group of community members that are taking a deep dive into this work with us on behalf of the wider community. It's made up of, we've got representatives from both Te Hapu o Ngāti Wheki and Te Runanga o Koukourarata, and we have business interests, youth. We've got a representative of the local water zone committee and community board, and a couple of wider city representatives that sit on that panel as well. They are supported by a specialist and technical advisory group, which brings a whole heap of expertise to the table. So we've got council asset managers that sit alongside coastal scientists. We've got representatives from DOC, public health, and economists that sit on that advisory group as well. So one of the first things that the coastal panel did when we kicked off was to look at how people and places and things across the harbour would be impacted by coastal hazards over the next 30 years. We know that we can't plan for every inch of the coastline all at once, so it was really important for us that we identified where we needed to focus our attention in the first instance. They identified the 6 priority adaptation locations that have just popped up on your screen there. And of course, Purau and Koukourarata are 2 of those, and they're the ones that we're going to be talking about tonight. Get Crystal to flick on to the next slide. Perfect. So I guess the key takeaway from this slide is that it's not the first conversation that we have had with you. It's also not going to be the last. There's a whole heap of work that kind of sits behind these 6 boxes up on the screen. But I guess the bit that I want to touch on is that last year you told us what you valued about living in your area and which assets or things mattered most to you. The panel took this information or these values and turned them into community objectives that have helped to guide the development of draft adaptation pathways over the past year or so. So they're really at a point in the process now where they want to check in with you, the wider community, and make sure that we're all on the right track and looking at the right options before we invest any more time or resources into shaping those up any further. It means that your feedback is really important to us at this point. It's going to let the coastal panel know that we're looking at the right options. It's also going to help to inform what we call the selection of or the identification of preferred pathways, which we will come back out to test with you next year before they go to council for a decision. The graph at the bottom or the image at the bottom of the slide is an example of what an adaptation pathway could look like. We call these metro map style diagrams, and they're not always the easiest to understand. So before we go any further, I am going to pass you over to Tom, who's going to run you through some of the key things that you should know about how to read these diagrams.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks again for being here. Yeah, feel free to start the video up, Crystal. Yeah, so essentially these are diagrams that are shown in various places on our webpage to indicate some of the possible options or different actions that council and the community could make to essentially adapt and manage different public assets. So tonight we'll be talking a bit about these adaptation pathways that have been put forward by the Coastal Panel for both Purau and Koukourarata. So now what I'll just do is sort of take you through some parts of what these graphics are showing. So that firstly we start with that black line along the top, which is just indicating that these pathways are representing what we might do over the next sort of 100 years from current day to 100 years on the far right of that arrow. Yeah, feel free to flick a little bit further through, Crystal. And then what we show is these various different options on the graphic here. So now what we can see here is the maintain option. So this pathway here is relating to just a conceptual road. This is just an example. So this is indicating that the maintenance option, which would largely be just doing what we're doing for this low-lying vulnerable section of road, would be feasible for a period, likely for around sort of 20 or sort of 10 to 20 years, as is indicated by the length of that grey line, before a different action or option might be needed to reduce the coastal hazard impacts that were occurring to that low-lying road, for example. And then the choice at that point is shown by these 2 different shades of green. So the top one is indicating that we could flood-proof and raise that road to reduce flooding impacts on it and allow users of the road, so the community and other user groups, to access across that space and avoid those impacts. And then the sort of moss-coloured line at the bottom is indicating Another option that could be used at that point, or perhaps later into the future, which is a road relocation. So that would be sort of finding an alternate route for the road network, and avoiding a sort of flood-prone area, for example. And so, yeah, avoiding those impacts and reducing longer-term costs. Yeah, I'll get you to flick through to the end of this graphic now, Crystal. One really important thing with adaptation planning is that we're not planning based on timeframes necessarily, but more importantly on the impacts that might occur in time. So there's still, while we know sea levels are rising and impacts are going to become more frequent and severe, we don't know the exact rate of sea level rise and when these impacts might arise, because there's storms that are sometimes infrequent, for example. So what these various symbols, the signals, triggers, and thresholds sort of represent is these different factors or conditions that might occur in time and inform a decision by council and the community to, for example, change from one option to another. So in this example, we might maintain the road for a period, but things might happen like impacts or damages to that road, or closures that are impacting the community's ability to get to work and other things, and we could monitor those different conditions. And when they become too much, for example, we could make a choice to move to a different option. So the point of adaptation planning is that we consider these different factors and conditions to inform when we do something, rather than just sort of guessing at when that might occur. Yeah, next slide. Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, so just what I want to touch on this slide, and this is very much related to the last one, is that when the Coastal Panel have been producing these adaptation pathways for each of these different locations, so Purau and Koukourarata tonight, they've been considering the full suite of adaptation options. So we've got this document on our webpage called the Catalogue of Coastal Hazard Adaptation Options, and those options fall within these sort of 5 classes of approach. And our specialist and technical advisory group has helped the Coastal Panel to consider the sort of suitability of these different options in each of the different sites or locations that we've been planning for. Yeah, and this is things from, engineering and protection options like seawalls and rock revetments, through to more nature-based options like wetlands and dune systems, or relocating assets to inland locations, for example, amongst a range of other options. Yeah, so I'll talk to you again shortly, but I'll pass you back to Jane, or pass you to Jane for the next slide.
Right. Well, Ruby mentioned earlier that we have a coastal adaptation framework in which we set out our policy approach essentially to adaptation planning, including the decision that we would focus our funds and planning around public assets. And I just wanted to pull up here the full wording of that principle so that you understand where we're coming from there. Essentially, we are planning for the whole community, but any funds and the focus of our planning is around those public assets. These are fundamental to communities. These are the roads we all rely on to drive to work, and the pipes that deliver the water to our homes. So as you can see, these are also very important aspects to a community in the future. We do, though, really acknowledge that with our focus on public assets, there are a lot of remaining questions for private asset owners, for people with private properties. And we know that for some people who are very close to hazard areas, they will be feeling anxious and worried about their private property. And we really do acknowledge and understand that. Essentially, the things that we are doing in that space is we have written to almost 100 households around the Whakaropō Harbour through to Koukourarata, where those homes are, or these properties are understood to be at risk of coastal hazards in the nearest term, in the next sort of 20 to 30 odd years, with 20 centimetres of sea level rise. And we've provided them with some information about what is happening with the government, what the council's role is, what we think insurers are up to, and some of those other pieces of information that hopefully will be of help to them. Some of that information is captured on a fact sheet that's available to anybody on the council website, and Crystal may be able to pop a link into that fact sheet onto the chat. I think she's onto it already. So we're really wanting to share as much information as possible with private property owners. However, importantly, as a council, we've got a really a big role to play in advocating on behalf of private property owners to central government for a faster level of certainty about what will happen to people's homes if they are at risk of climate hazards. So the last government was intending to introduce a climate adaptation bill. They did not get to do that within their term of government. And so instead they set up an inquiry into managed retreat, or which they're calling community-led retreat, and funding adaptation. And so council submitted to that inquiry and made a very strong point around the need for property owners to have certainty much sooner about what it might mean for them if, for example, their home is in an area where there needs to be a retreat. So I guess that's another important role we play. We understand the impacts of people with this uncertainty, and we have some experience after the earthquakes in Christchurch, of course, with a retreat in the red zone. So we're very much working with central government to try and share that information and get a bit more clarity faster for private property owners. I think we're going to move into questions now, so I will turn my mic off.
Great, thanks, Jane. So yeah, we've covered a little bit on the program so far and a bit of the background. So if you've got any questions, feel free to pop these in the chat now. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next section. All right, team, it doesn't. Oh no, it looks like somebody is typing. Okay, I will give you a few minutes for that one then.
Hi, Diane. While you're just typing your question, I thought I'd have a minister retreat. Oh, okay. So, sorry, I'm probably not speaking clearly enough. The government has the Ministry of for the Environment is the government department that's responsible essentially for this area of activity, and they have been calling this managed retreat. But when the select committee inquiry was set up, it was set up to look into community-led retreat. And what informed that inquiry was a paper by a working group, and that working group was made up of a range of experts from insurance, banking, local government, academia, a range of different areas. And they put this paper up to the inquiry, which was it's about 300 pages long, and it's essentially proposed a process for community-led retreat. So while the inquiry is asking us how we want to see managed retreat occur, they've also got this working group paper which suggests an approach called community-led retreat. And the working group paper sets out an approach in which there are layers of community engagement, but ultimately it proposes that the decisions are not made by communities. And so one of the things that council submitted on when we responded to the inquiry was to say it probably shouldn't be called community-led retreat if it's not the community who's leading the planning and also the decision making about a retreat. So I'm giving you the title of the inquiry so that you can look it up if you'd like to. I can find a link and put it onto the chat in a minute. But you're correct. It's a different name for managed retreat that's being tested, I think, essentially through that process.
Awesome, thanks for that, Jane. What we'll do now is we'll move into the session for Purau, and then we'll cover any extra questions when we stop for questions at the end of the Purau section. So if you are waiting to hear about the Koukourarata section, then feel free to pop away, grab yourself a cuppa and pop back in 10-15 minutes or so, and we might be at that point. Otherwise, I'll hand back to the team and they can kick off on Purau. Just remember, pop your questions in the chat when you've got them, and if you can't use that chat function, then please do email us through at letstalk@ccc.gobt.nz. Hand back to the team now.
Awesome. And Krista, I might just get you to flick immediately onto the next slide there. Cool. So I mentioned a little bit earlier on that late last year we asked each community to tell us what it is that they valued about living in their area. In Purau, people talked a lot about how important their natural environment was. So things like the native wildlife, healthy waterways, and having access to a nice clean beach. One of the questions that we asked was, what would you want this coastline to look like in 100 years' time? And the two key themes that came out of that in Purau were around wanting to enhance these natural values and also the importance of safe and reliable access to Purau as well. The ability to access the water for recreation, so things like swimming, boating, kayaking, walking along the beach was also a really big one. And almost everyone that filled out the survey from Purau talked about how important the jetty and the boat ramp were to them as well. So these are just some of the things that the Coastal Panel has kept in mind as they've drafted pathways for the public assets in this area, of which the road and the boat ramp and jetty are some of those. So I'm going to pass you over to Tom now, who's going to start talking about that in a bit more detail.
Cool. So before I get into sort of sharing the draft adaptation pathways that the Coastal Panel has produced, we thought it would be useful to give a bit of context about sort of what's going on, the hazards and the assets in Purau, which many of you will be, or all of you even will be sort of well aware of. So what the map on the left-hand side of the screen is showing is a sort of modelled or projected coastal flooding event. So 1 in 100 year coastal flooding event with 40 centimetres of sea level rise. So imagine a future where we have 40 centimetres of sea level rise and then have a 1 in 100 year coastal storm on top of that. This is the kind of flood extent and depth that we would that has been predicted for Purau. So you can see flood depths are largely relatively shallow, but in some places up to sort of 0.5 metre or a bit more in some of the locations, particularly close to the coast or near Purau stream. Then to sort of touch on is some of the assets that are being identified in this visual. So up the top left, we've got the assets, some marine assets, which we appreciate are very highly valued. So the local jetty and the nearby boat ramp. And then as we move sort of south into the community itself, we've got the reserve. Obviously, you know, there's a public toilet in a sort of really sorry state on that reserve currently. And then there's the road that winds through along Purau Avenue and towards Camp Bay as well. So the roads are obviously a real focus of this visual. You can see that particularly around the stream, and then down at the Camp Bay end of Purau, the road is particularly close to the shoreline. So erosion of that beach, so wearing away of the coast from coastal processes and tides and whatnot, could essentially affect that road, erode it, and mean that council might need to employ some action or option to either protect that road or move it or otherwise sort of manage that risk. So yeah, that's just a bit about some of the assets. What we'll do now is we'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, so down that right-hand side of the page, I sort of touched on the road, the parks reserve, the public toilet there, and then the jetty and boat ramp. So if you were to jump on our webpage now and look under the Purau priority adaptation location, you could find our material on each of those assets specifically. I'll focus a bit on the jetty and boat ramp and on the road for this evening. But am happy to field questions on any of those assets if they come up. So just to what we want to do here first is sort of touch on the fact that there are generally two kind of schools or ways that these assets, regardless of which ones we're talking about, might sort of be managed. So there's one school of thinking which is called hold the line, which is largely employ different investments or options to protect assets in the locations that they are today. So it might involve things like building rock armour or other kinds of defences to keep the road on its existing alignment, to protect the reserve, for example, even to lift or protect the jetty and boat ramp as other examples. These kinds of options will likely be suitable for a time, but increasingly with higher sea levels will be more challenging and expensive to retain and maintain into the future. The next option, which we've labelled as working with nature down the bottom of this page, is more about creating space for coastal processes, living with the future, sort of coming to learn to live with the impacts, and could largely involve moving, removing or closing public assets to accommodate rising seas and reduce environmental impacts. So in Purau, this might involve something like finding an alternate route for sections of the road that are significantly impacted in the future as they become impacted, or for example deciding to not protect the reserve, allow it to be flooded, and allow those natural processes to take place. So what I'll ask Crystal to do now is flick to the next slide. Yeah, so now I'm just going to talk you through sort of two of the draft adaptation pathways that the Coastal Panel has produced. So the first one relates to the jetty and the boat ramp, which were in that top left of the image I showed earlier. So if we start at the top with the jetty and boat ramp, what's indicated here is that based on our hazard assessments and conditions assessments of these assets, we think that they could largely last around sort of 15 to 20 years longer in their sort of existing sort of location and condition before a more substantive sort of investment would be required to protect or significantly raise these assets to reduce their impacts from erosion and flooding, for example. So what's indicated here is obviously how long that maintain option might work for, and then some of the alternate options or choices that might be available. So the ones that the Coastal Panel have put forward as part of this pathway are raising and protecting the assets, building new assets essentially, or removing or closing the assets as they're impacted in the future. It'd be fair to say that certainly, I know Paul Dow's on the call this evening, and member of the Coastal Panel, very clearly recognised that these assets are well used in Purau, and that option 3 could seem extreme, but as is the purpose of our draft adaptation pathways, we want to indicate the sort of the range of possible options. And there is obviously some choices and sort of optionality within the 4 options that are indicated there. So it's not necessarily suggesting that option 3 would be used in 20 years, but that there might be an option amongst others. And then if we go down to the roads, which is the draft pathway at the bottom of the page here, a little bit simpler, so just the 3 options indicated here. The first one being a sort of maintain option again, suspecting that option might last for around that sort of 20-year mark. Obviously noting that some sections of this road are much more at risk than others, depending on where they're located relative to the shoreline and their elevation and different things like that. So obviously this isn't suggesting that all the roads go on or anything like that. And then we have, again, in time, a choice to sort of flood-proof or protect the road on its existing alignment, or essentially move roads or reroute roads to more landward locations away from coastal hazard impacts. Again, you could, for example, maintain the road for a period, then flood-proof and protect the road for a period, and then eventually make a choice to move the road. Or alternatively, you might be able to move from maintain to move more swiftly, for example. These choices are absolutely yet to be made, but this is just sort of indicating those possibilities. The last thing I want to mention here on the roads, which will also apply to Koukourarata, is you can go on our webpage, and we've recently published a new little sub-page which is about moving around the harbour in the future. One thing we recognise then when looking at all these roads in different locations is that it's really important that we manage the road and the access around the harbour as sort of one big picture, as a network. And we also recognise that things like jetties and boat ramps and wharves and ferries, for example, are also possible part of a future sort of access, an access future for the harbour, or could be at some point in the future. So there might need to be a sort of mode shift. It might not necessarily be the best way to manage the roads by just making them all as resilient as we can, but rather it might be better to retain them at lower levels, but also have options to use access over water, for example, so a more robust ferry service, for example. So these are just some sort of ideas that we're sharing as well. Yeah, I'll pass back to Crystal now, and you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions about Purau before we move on. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. So yeah, if you've got some questions on Purau, then please chuck them in the chat. We will just cover off a question left over from the last section. So from Diane, she asked about what if somebody doesn't want to retreat? Jane, could you jump in and touch on that for us?
Yeah, hi Diane, that's a really good question. And it was one of the questions that the inquiry actually asked for feedback on. They put forward 2 options, one being a completely voluntary system, and the second choice being a mix of, well, they were calling it a mix of voluntary and compulsory, but essentially it meant that you would have to retreat, but you could choose when, sort of a phased approach to retreat. I can fully understand why people do not want to retreat. We often place a lot of time, love and care and have wonderful experiences in our homes, and that matters a lot, and it's very hard to give up. But there are some other arguments for perhaps having a mandatory retreat process. So I'll just go through a couple of those because there may be things that may be new considerations. So one of the concerns about a voluntary retreat process is that you can have some homes then left behind in an area, and the implications of that can be that services can start to cost a lot of money for councils to deliver to those homes. So, for example, after the red zoning in Christchurch, the annual cost of providing wastewater services to some of those properties was around about $25,000 a year, where it costs around about $220 per household in the rest of the city. So that's essentially a transfer of private costs to other ratepayers. So I'm just pointing out some of the challenges. It can also mean that, for example, land that has been retreated from can be used for other purposes. It could be restored for a wetland to allow species to retreat to, or it could be a place where we might build protection works. There are a range of things that could be done, and if there's still houses in there, again, that makes that just a little bit tricky. So again, that's another consideration. The third thing I'd raise is that there can sometimes be a risk to life for people, and so if you are in a very high risk area and there's a really significant storm event or a flood event, there is a possible risk to life, but not only the person who's decided to remain there, but potentially to emergency services who are then required to go into harm's way, essentially to help that person out of the area. So I understand both sides of the fence, but ultimately when Council put forward our submission on the inquiry, we did suggest that we were not so keen on a voluntary only system because of some of the implications of that for other people, I guess, ratepayers and for emergency services and for the future use of that land. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see which way the government does go on that once they pick that piece of work up again.
Great, thanks, Jane, and hopefully that helps to answer your question there, Diane. We've had another question come through from Vicky, and don't worry about jumping the gun. Any question is a great question. So I will direct this one towards Tom. Could a relocatable compostable toilet be installed in Purau at a much lower cost?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, it could. It's definitely it's one of the options that's actually indicated in the pathways for Purau. I didn't we haven't shared the public toilet draft adaptation pathways this evening, but it is at the back of our slide deck if we need to jump there, and it is on the web page, so you can certainly see it there. I'm just looking at it now. We have an option in there called build a relocatable toilet on the reserve. Yeah, there we are. Thank you, Crystal. Yeah, that top green one there, underneath the maintain option. So yeah, that's essentially indicating that, hey, we know the reserve is pretty wet and will be increasingly so. We also know that people, it's practical to have a public toilet here because there's, maybe not any nearby, for example. And there's a reserve and it makes sense to have their one in combination. But if it's going to be flooded more frequently and we don't want to build a permanent structure, for example, it might be logical to build a relocatable compostable toilet, for example. So that would be, one of the sorts of things that would be considered and has been put forward by the panel. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions for now. So we'll move on to the section on Koukourarata. If you've got a burning question, feel free to pop it in the chat and we'll get to it at the next stop.
Perfect. It's a lovely photo, but again, Crystal, I might just get you to jump on to the next slide. So going back to that conversation that we had about values late last year, one of the key things that was talked about in Koukourarata was the importance of safe road access in and out of the bay, and potentially even ensuring that there's a suitable kind of backup if that road was out of action. The road network was then obviously also talked about or pulled out as a key asset of importance to people that live out there, and also the wharf, with people recognizing that access doesn't need to just be by cars. The wharf is a pretty valuable backup and can be accessed via boat if needed. The other places and things that were kind of pulled out as key assets were the marae and also the natural environment. So people talked about the strong sense of community out in Koukourarata and the importance of that connection to the sea for things like kaimoana, recreation and lifestyle. So similar to Purau, when people were asked about what they wanted the coastline to look like in around 100 years, a lot of people talked about enhancing those natural values or the natural environment through things like planting and ensuring good water quality and encouraging native species to thrive. And so again, these are some of the things that the coastal panel has been keeping in mind as they've gone through the process of drafting adaptation pathways for the key public assets in the area, and those include the road and the wharf. Again, I'll pass you over to Tom for some more information.
Cool. Thank you, Ruby. Yeah, so one of the key, I guess, differences that is pretty clear to people that, go over the hill to Koukourarata, live there, recreate there, whatever, is that there is a number of different locations that are low-lying and therefore likely to be or are impacted by coastal flooding and even river and stream flooding, for example. So we've got the sort of head of the harbour up near Fernley Point Road, and then more on the sort of top right of the image on the left is the sort of community itself along Par Road, and then towards the marae as well. Yeah, so there's obviously sections of road at the head of the harbour which are particularly low-lying in a ecologically significant area as well. So any choices to sort of build up or out or protect those roads would certainly have implications for that sort of wider environment. Not suggesting that that couldn't be done, but that would be something that would need to be sort of considered. And then we move into, if we go over to Par Road, there are sections of that road that are actually quite frequently impacted by large tides, but also by stream flooding, particularly over the last few years with some heavy rainfall, which is only made worse by big high tides, spring tides and king tides. So you can see that sort of orange section of road at Par Road as well. The other assets again that we're looking at in Koukourarata, again, public toilet, which is a bit of a sort of legacy of conversation around the future of that asset. So our the coastal panel have been looking at some of the options available to manage the impacts on that asset. But also we've got Koukourarata Wharf, which is valued by the community, but also by local runanga as well, for not only recreational purposes, but also potentially for sort of economic purposes too. So there's a number of sort of valued public assets there. Again, like Purau, would want to note that there's obviously a number of residential properties that are in these low-lying, flood-prone and erosion-prone areas as well, particularly near Par Road and Land of Par Road, and a number of urupa and other culturally significant sites that runanga are doing a lot of planning for as well. So I'll move on to the next slide now. Thank you, Crystal. Cool. So what we're looking at, again, we've got along that right-hand side, just the roads, wharf and public toilet are the assets that the coastal panel have produced draft adaptation pathways for. The road being a big one because it's in, as I mentioned, a range of different locations where it is vulnerable. And again, I'll just sort of sum up these two sort of classes or approaches of options that might be available in Koukourarata like they were in Purau. So the hold the line option again is about retaining the assets in the locations that they are. Generally, it was easier over shorter timeframes before sea levels have raised by significant amounts, and more difficult and expensive from a sort of maintenance perspective in the longer run. This could involve things again like rock walls and protection of road assets, for example, maybe lifting of the local wharf at Koukourarata, for example. Public toilet could be sort of flood-proofed and raised, for example, as well, and kept in a sort of relatively seaward location. And then the working with nature option or approach again is about accommodating and sort of moving away from rising seas and increasingly frequent tidal and coastal inundation and impacts. So it would involve essentially, moving away, perhaps removing some of the less sort of core services or assets along the sort of shorefront. So whether that's the public toilet, for example, and then we've got so I've got moving, removing, or yeah, like I mentioned, the sort of closure as well. So again, sort of just group those two sort of different kinds of options into those approaches that might be available. Crystal, I'll get you to flick on to the next slide now. Cool. Yeah, so again, we've just decided to focus on two of the draft adaptation pathways this evening for Koukourarata, so the wharf and the road. The wharf here is very much similar to what was presented for Purau for the jetty and boat ramp, so largely indicating that that asset might be sort of more reasonably be able to function for a sorry, I'm just noticing as I look at this that wharf and road labels are flicked the wrong way around, so that's my mistake. So as I talk about the wharf, please look at the pathways on the bottom of the screen. That's my mistake. So the grey line on that bottom graphic is showing that the wharf could function for a period of sort of closer to 10 years. I was thinking the 20 was a bit long. And before we have a choice to ultimately raise and protect that existing wharf or build a sort of alternate, more resilient structure in that location. You can see here that the coastal panel didn't put forward an option to remove this asset. Through the conversations with Runanga and coastal panel, sort of recognised the significance of that asset, particularly as a potential lifeline link to other parts of Littleton Harbour and the city in the events of emergency. So saw that as quite a critical service to that local community that might otherwise be isolated by a range of different natural hazard events such as heavy rainfall and landslips on the hill, or snow and ice, or coastal flooding, for example. So you can see here that the options put forward are largely about retaining that asset in some way, although there's some different ways that that might be done, which might come at different costs. And yeah, before I move on to the road ones, just to mention here, I won't sort of rattle off the numbers, but we have indicated on our online material some sort of high level costings for these different lines, these different pathways on these maps. So you can sort of get online and have some sense of what these different options might cost. So when you're giving some feedback, you can sort of consider how appropriate you think those investments might be with regard to the sort of value add that they have for you and the other people that live in these places. Then I'll move on to the roads pathway, which is up the top here, indicated here that many parts of the road can likely be retained in their existing locations for as much as sort of 15 to 20 years, as indicated by the length of that grey line. There might be sections of particularly Par Road that could be impacted and need a more substantive investment a little bit before that. But what's indicated here again is that there could be choices to that, the green line to flood-proof the road and raise that road up to protect it, or alternatively to move the roads to higher ground. So when we talk about that bottom option, the moving the roads, we're primarily talking about the sections at the head of the harbour, the Fernley Point Road, and the other particularly low-lying bit is that Par Road. So essentially looking at inland alternate routes that could be utilised to avoid the shorefront and the impacts that occur in those locations. Obviously, we recognise that those would not be easy choices or options or cheap options. Recognise that council might need to navigate things like land purchase, private property, obviously relations with various local user groups and local iwi, for example. So we do start those conversations very early with the likes of Purunanga or Koukourarata in this case, for example. But yeah, I'll sort of stop on this slide now again. Now's your opportunity to ask some questions about the wharf or road in Koukourarata or anything else that you've heard tonight. And I guess just in case I don't get a chance again, and I know Crystal will hammer this home, but I'd encourage you all to jump on our webpage and we'll share the link at the end. So please get on there and share your thoughts. It'll be very much appreciated. And thank you for listening tonight as well.
Thanks for that, Tom. So yeah, as with before, chuck your questions in the chat if you've got any. Remember, you can email them through to us at letstalk@ccc.govt.nz. I'll give it a moment to see if anyone's got any questions for us. It looks like you guys are a really quiet bunch, and we might finish up a little bit early. So I'll move on with our other couple of slides. If you've got anything that you think of later, then you can email us. As Tom said, it's really important that we get your feedback on these draft adaptation pathways. The coastal panel obviously are representatives of the community, but it's really important that they get the feedback from the wider community on whether or not we're on the right track with these pathways. So it is really important that you take the time and let us know what you think. We'll pop the link into the chat now. But it is also online at letstalk.ccc.govt.nz. You can jump on there and let us know what you think by the 10th of December. So we've now reached the end of our presentation. Thank you everyone for taking the time out of your evening to join us tonight. I hope that you've found it useful. If you've got any feedback on the session or any more questions or comments about the project, then please contact us. The details are on the slide in front of you now. We'll be in touch in the coming days with answers to your questions and links to watch the session. If you've got anything else you want to send through to us, then email it through. Thanks again from myself and from all of our team. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Tēnā koutou katoa.